And Karen, did you want to welcome everybody first?
Thank you. Yes, that'd be fine. So thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Karen Gravlin. I am the library consultant for Inclusive Services and director of the AIL Library. And we are so happy to be collaborating with Inclusive Arts Vermont to offer this training to you all today. I just wanted to put out there that I am always available if you have questions. So even outside of these trainings, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns about accessibility or inclusive services or anything like that. And I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you, Heidi.
Great. Thank you, Karen, and thanks for the opportunity. As we begin, we pause to acknowledge the place we exist, connect, and create is the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people, one of 5 Wabanaki nations who have a continued and enduring presence with this land. Presence with mountains, with vistas, with forests, waters, and winds. Presence with people, culture and creations. Presence with light. We learned that in Abenaki, Waban refers to the white flickering light in the sky, and Aki is the word for land or the earth. So the Wabanaki are the people of the Dawnlands. We acknowledge Wabanaki ancestors, past, present, and future. And with that, I'll add my introduction. My name is Heidi Swevens, and I use she, they pronouns. I am the Director of Community Partnerships with Inclusive Arts Vermont, and I'm thrilled to be here today. I love that I get to do workshops and connect with people about access and inclusion in the community. For access purposes, I'll do a visual description of myself and surroundings. I have blue eyes and pale skin with short brown hair, and today I'm wearing a plaid button-down shirt with a purple tank top underneath. Behind me, the same abstract rectangle with lots of colors against a whitish wall. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Heidi. Welcome, everyone. We've had a few more people join us. So before I start, I just want to remind folks to change your Zoom name to your name or whatever you want us to call you. That would be great. And to mute yourself if you're not the one speaking. That's really helpful to cut down on background noise. All right, I'm going to share my screen really quick before I get moving too fast here. Okay. Karen, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that, the slides? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I will start by introducing myself. Again, I'm Katie Miller. I am the Executive Director here at Inclusive Arts Vermont, and I have the pleasure of doing many of our PD and training opportunities with Heidi. I am a woman in her mid-30s. I have pale skin and brown and silver and blonde hair. I have big black glasses on today, and I'm wearing a gray and white striped shirt. I'm seated in my bedroom, which has gray blue walls and chunky white trim. I want to welcome you all to join us however you are today. At Inclusive Arts Vermont, we really truly believe that we're all humans first and everything else comes after. So turn your video on if you want to be here visually on screen with us. Leave it off if you want to. Feel free to participate out loud or in the chat box, and get up, move around, stretch, take bio breaks as you need them, whatever you need. It's totally fine if you have to be joined by humans, big or small. You might see one of mine pop in and out of here at some point. Animals, whatever you need, just take care of yourself, and we welcome that. This session today is being recorded, and it will be available on the Department of Libraries website with a transcript after this training is complete. Okay, and this slide that's up on my screen right now has a white background, and it says Department of Library Series Meeting Accommodation Requests, and it has the Inclusive Arts Vermont logo all on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, there's a headshot of myself and then a headshot of Heidi. Okay, this next slide has a white background, and it says Who here has responded to an accommodation request? Feel free to write or draw to reflect. And Heidi's going to elaborate more on that.
Great, thanks, Katie. You might, if you've been with us before, you might guess that we want to begin our training with inviting you into the conversation, into the space with a prompt. And so this one, sort of the first part is a yes, no, and this seems like a chat box group. So who here has responded to an accommodation request? You can do thumbs up, yes, no, within your time at the library, or anywhere. The quick, how many people have responded? And Katie, I'm not sure from your screen share what you're able to access with that or not, actually.
I'm currently trying to bring all my windows back up, so thanks for that. A couple people so far have said no, they have not.
Okay, so that means there's some yeses. And the good news is we're going to talk all about meeting accommodation requests today. We probably won't exhaust all of the possible angles, but we want to give you a sense of kind of what to expect, what to respond, and where to go with more questions. A little bit more reflection, and this you can think about, doodle, draw, write, put in the chat box or speak out loud if you'd like, but what was the accommodation request? So there's a couple possibilities here. What was the kind of accommodation request if you responded to one? And did you learn anything from the experience? And or aside from you individually, what accommodations has the library where you are connected, what kinds of accommodations are available there? And this is not a right or a wrong, this is not a test, this is just a kind of get you thinking a little bit about the topic at hand. We'll give maybe, 60 seconds, a minute or two for this to come in with the chats. So what kinds of accommodations have you responded to? Did you learn anything? Or what does the library you have offer for accommodations and access?
Jeanette says ASL interpretation and live transcription, and Cheryl said yes, visual aids, talking books, and magnified screens and readers. Holly was originally no, but says changing my answer. We did have a request to use closed captions at a youth movie we showed one year.
Great. Thank you. And we'll shift from this now, but thank you for those responses. And also I appreciate the shifting response after a little bit more thought. Sometimes that's just how, ideas sprinkle in. I also just want to name that the Talking Books program is something Katie and I have on the outline for later, because that is a prime example actually of accommodations for access to printed and text materials. So kudos to the library services. And I think we're ready to move on to the next slide, Katie.
I do want to add really quick that a few people were saying, I learned not all live transcriptions are created equally in quality. And then Catherine, I said that's totally true. And then Catherine said translation of library documents and ASL. And Sue says we just added magnifiers to our collection and large print keyboards for our computers. Okay, so the slide up on screen right now is another white background, and at the top it says defining accommodation. Heidi, would you like me to read all the text on this slide? How would you like me to do this?
Yeah, please, if you don't mind reading it.
Okay, so the first one, says the term quote unquote accommodation may be used to describe an alteration of environment, curriculum format, or equipment that allows an individual with a disability to gain access to content and or complete assigned tasks. And that's from the Washington University. Number 2 is an accommodation is a change that removes a barrier to learning or getting work done. And that is from understood.org. In addition to accommodations, we will also use the term quote unquote access features, which are accommodations that your library, events, or program provide and that you want to let the community know about. Definition: access features are proactive in the design and planning, whereas accommodations are responsive.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to do a quick check-in with everybody. Do those sort of foundational definitions make sense to people? Yes, no, thumbs up.
Okay, a few thumbs up and a couple yeses in the chat. So yeah, sounds like.
Great. And so the flow for today, we're going to define accommodation. We're going to go into a little bit of the concepts, circle back around to concepts of disability and models of disability to bring in some of the previous content. Then we're going to specify kinds of accommodations and access features that some of you already mentioned in the chat box. We're going to share some examples and have time for questions. And then kind of go through sort of a general like day in the life of accommodation request. So you have a sense of that process as we wind down. So as Katie mentioned, there's a couple of different accommodation definitions here. Google will show you endless more, but essentially this sort of the change or alteration in something so that a person can either access content and material or contribute. And those kind of link to communication. As we've talked about before, communication links to participation and engagement and community and the programs that libraries offer and the reading materials and other materials that are within the library setting. One point that is on the slide, but I want to say again, you'll hear us talk in this workshop and in others about accommodations and access features. They're kind of two sides of the same thing. The feature itself or the accommodation itself might be the same, but accommodations are done responsively. So somebody makes an accommodation request because it's something that they need a change or an alteration in, whereas an access feature is something that you're providing just because. So, well, not just because, but just because you're aware of people understanding and accessing information in different ways. And I'm going to use the example of American Sign Language here. So if you're going to do an event like Inclusive Arts Vermont does artist talks on Zoom, and we proactively hire an ASL interpreter, and that is an access feature that we market ahead of time. So anybody in the community will know if they show up this event, there's going to be ASL provided. So that's an access feature. With access features that you're doing as a program proactively, you want to let the community know about it. You want to, put it out there and say, here's what we're doing. Here's the access feature. Because somebody who's deaf or who uses ASL, that's an essential, thing for them to be able to participate. If that feature is not going to be there, somebody still might contact a person at the library and make that accommodation request. So somebody could request ASL, and that would be an accommodation in response to the request. The service itself, the feature is still the American Sign Language interpretation. There's proactive, there's responsive, and all the same, the person gets access to the information and to the program. Does that make sense? I'm holding my hand up, sort of like wondering and waiting. Thanks for the communication back and forth. It's, it's one of those Zoom things. It's just important to know that I'm, that it's landing in somebody's world and making sense. And this cycles back around, as I was saying before, to the models of disability, where one of the key concepts is in the medical model, the disabilities within the person and it's a problem. The social and some of the cultural models, the focal point or the entry point is about removing barriers. So when you make access features available, whether that's ASL, American Sign Language, for library space, it could be many other things, including talking books or the, I think it's called it used to be books on tape. I don't know exactly. This is the ABLE library stuff. I'm not sure what the exact program name is now, and I don't want to misrepresent it, but the audio recordings and that information in alternative format is a primary example of an access feature that libraries have and the National Library Service has. You also might have a quiet space in the library for people to go for less sensory stimulation, magnification, those kinds of things are all available at your libraries. And those address that potential barriers that somebody with a disability might have without focusing exclusively on the disability itself. I'm going to check my notes. Else. And the other thing I just want to mention before we kind of move on to the next slide is that in the previous workshops, a couple of you mentioned universal design for learning. And I think that's really important to echo here when we talk about meeting accommodation requests. And whether you're providing access features sort of proactively or in response, the idea of universal design is, the multiple options, multiple options, multiple options. And while some access features might be intended with one group of people in mind, they can have benefits for all. So the universal design for programming, the thinking in the head, the multiple options, do we have this in print? Do we have this visually? Do we have it auditorily? What is this physical setup of the space, the Zoom space or the digital space? All of those multiple options will lead to more accessibility for more people. And one other example that Karen just mentioned is she was joining us, and I hope this is okay to mention, Karen. It's about our mass exhibition where we have tactile representations and tactile elements of some of the pieces. Yes, very much intended for people with blindness or low vision to access the materials through touch. But that is something that many people, benefit from actually tactily engaging with the materials. So while that's an art exhibition, the concept of universal design is there. And so I'm going to pause there, Katie, and pass it on to you for the next slide.
All right, this slide is again a white background and across the top in black text it says accommodations and access symbols. On the right hand side there's a large black question mark inside a black circle, and underneath it says see Inclusive Arts Vermont tip sheet for more. And on the left hand side there's a grid of 9 different accessibility symbols that I will go into more detail what each one of them is in just a moment. But first what I want to talk about is the types of accommodations or categories of accommodations. I'm going to share a link to an article in the chat box, and don't worry, we will share this with all of you later as well in a follow-up email. But there are 4 types of accommodations, and those are presentation, response, setting, time, and scheduling. And I'm going to put those all in the chat box for you as well. So what is the difference? Presentation is a change in the way information is presented. So for example, audiobooks instead of a traditional text like hardcover book. Response is a change in the way people complete assignments or work. So an example of that might be keyboards instead of writing by hand. Or at Inclusive Arts Vermont, one thing we do, we're working on right now, is setting up a Google form so that teaching artists can dictate their logs in about their programs and workshops as opposed to handwriting it or typing it all out. There you can make accommodations in the setting, so a change in learning or working environment. So that could be providing a quiet room for someone who needs that in order to take a test, and timing and scheduling, which is a change of time for a task. So in the workplace, that can look like flexible working hours. In school, it could look like extra time to do homework. In a program setting, it could look like not putting a time limit on certain activities and letting people sort of free flow through it and take as long as they need to. I'm going to copy from the link I sent you before these definitions from their website. I do want to note though that some of the language they use is not necessarily, this is sort of a rabbit hole into language, but it's not necessarily the same language we would use at Inclusive Arts Vermont. For example, when they say audiobooks for people with reading challenges, like we might use different language to describe that. But here it is. Okay, any questions on those 4 types of accommodations? Presentation, response, setting, and timing. No? Okay, there's going to be time at the end too if questions pop up. So the other thing to note about these categories is that they all focus on the removal or adjustment of barriers rather than the disability specifically. So it's not like these accommodations are specific to one specific diagnosis. They're more about removing barriers to participation. Okay, so let's talk about these access symbols that are up on the screen. So access symbols, these are things you can put on marketing materials so that people are aware that your program has these things available. And I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like at the end. So these access symbols on this slide I'll go clockwise from the top left and then do the middle one. We have closed captioning, open captioning, American Sign Language, Braille, large print, assisted listening, physical accessibility, so like ramps, elevators, things like that. I believe this one is for amplified telephone. There's another one that looks sort of similar that has a telephone on it you might see for TTY or relay service. And the one in the center is an image of a person holding a cane, and it's meant to represent. We've asked this question before of the New England ADA Center. Is this one specifically for sighted guide or like a specific subset of accommodations? And they say it's more of a general overarching services for people with blindness or low vision. So that one is a little bit up for interpretation. And the big one on the right is the question mark symbol. And we tell people all the time, if you get nothing else out of your time with us, it's to use the question mark symbol. And what this question mark symbol on a piece of marketing material, like a flyer or a poster or a graphic on your social media, tells someone is that if someone with a disability sees this, they say, oh, I know this symbol, and this symbol, in theory, will have the contact information next to it for who to contact on how to make accommodation requests. So what this symbol says to people is it says, we might not know all the answers, but we're willing to figure it out with you and try to make this as accessible as possible. Anecdotally, I can tell you that as the parent of a kid with multiple disabilities, if I see this on a marketing material, I am way more apt to go to this program than I am something else, because I know they're at least willing to hear what accommodations we need. So it's a great place to start. We also have, if I can find my mouse, too many monitors. Here we go. This sheet, it's not going to pull up. When I'm done speaking, I will share a link that has a sheet on how to use this question mark symbol. And I'm going to show you in a couple of examples in a second what this looks like as well. So these are two posters. This is a white slide, and on top of it are two posters side by side. The one on the left is really colorful. It has a sort of abstract with geometric shapes, purple, orange, and pink background. And it's a poster for our Boom Vermont Drum Festival that we used to have. And on the right-hand side is a poster where the top third is a grid of different pieces of artwork, and the bottom has, in big blue letters, it says a new, and a bunch of text about our past exhibition as well. Now, you'll notice on these that there's a row on the bottom third of each of these of accessibility symbols. What I want to talk about first is the question mark symbol, which is on both of them. On the Boom one, it's on the right-hand side right here where I'm circling my mouse. And on the new one, it's on the lower left-hand side. But for each of them, you'll notice it says for information or accessibility requests, contact. And then it has a name and a phone number. That's really important because it gives people multiple options for how to contact you. Not everyone is comfortable with the phone, and not everyone's comfortable with email. I think one of these does this better than the other, where it also lists an individual, an actual person's name to contact. The reason we use our info email is because I'm the one who answers it, and we know that, right? Most organizations, I don't recommend that they use a generic email, because if nobody checks it for a few days or weeks or whatever, and then the next thing you know, someone's accommodation request gets missed, to use a specific person.
Katie, might I add on that one? The reason we didn't use Katie at Inclusive Arts Vermont was because you were preparing for maternity leave.
Yes.
So we had a backup plan with that.
Yeah, actually for both of these, this is really funny, Heidi. I think the one on the left, I was coming back from one maternity leave, and the one on the right, I was getting ready to go on a different one. So we knew that like one of the first things when I go on leave is we transfer who's opening the info email, but we knew it would go to somebody. So that's
behind the scenes with Access. Sorry.
Right. It's a workaround. So that's the question mark symbol. Underneath the question mark symbol on both of these, you're going to notice a row of different accessibility symbols. So on the ANU poster, for example, there's the wheelchair one for physical access, large print, Braille. These are usually printed far larger than this, so they're hard to read on the screen for me. There's the sighted guide, audio description, assistive listening, and ASL. Now, the reason all of those are on there is because for this specific event, the opening reception, we were going to have all of those symbols available. And this is the next really important point with these symbols. The ones specific to different accommodations, you don't want to put on a marketing material unless you're guaranteed to have them there. It's less like a menu of options than it is, this is what's definitely going to be served. And if you were going to write this out, say like on a Facebook event, you can't add all these symbols, right? We would put accessibility. This event will feature the whole list I just mentioned. For further requests, contact so-and-so. Does that make sense to people, the access symbols and how to use them? Can I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a yes or a no or a... All right, lots of thumbs up. I love it. I like it when they start popping up. Okay.
Katie, can we ask if people are using the access symbols already? As like a follow-up.
Yeah. Why don't you give me a thumbs up or say yes in the chat if you are using access symbols already in your marketing materials. All right, I'm going to take that as a no. Cheryl says we always put the wheelchair symbol as we have an elevator. Great, that's exactly what that's for. Yep. Mm-hmm. And Jeanette says, yes, it does make sense. Scheduling is always challenging since you often don't get confirmation from the ASL folks until late in the game. We are not currently using them. I can tell you in terms of American Sign Language interpretation, we as a disability service organization make it a point to have ASL interpreters at every public facing event that we do. It's just part of what we do. Many organizations will choose to not do it unless it's requested. And I think that sort of depends on you knowing your audience and who normally shows up and making sure that there's a way for people to request it if they do want it, which adding the question mark symbol is the easiest way to do that, I think. Okay, so next I'm going to unshare my screen for a second. And I'm going to talk about coordinating some and delivering some of the most used accommodation features. And those are American Sign Language. So if you need to reserve an American Sign Language interpreter, you're going to contact a company called VanCrow. And I'm going to look up their link right now while I'm talking. And through them, you will submit all of your information to their portal, and they will help match you to an American Sign Language interpreter. I feel like the VanCrow service is really similar. It's essentially what the Vermont Interpreter Referral Service became. So if you've ever used that, it's a very similar process. And that is for interpreters. They can do both virtual interpreters for virtual public like live streaming events and in-person events. We often get the question, so I'm just going to put it out there. The typical cost for an interpreter is it ranges, but I would say the average is somewhere between $80 and $100 an hour, plus mileage. And they typically work in pairs. And the reason for that is because American Sign Language is really complex. It's a really tough brain task. You know, they're listening to one language while translating it in their brain and then delivering it back to somebody else at a delay from what they're hearing it with their physical body. So typically they work in pairs and one person will interpret for a little bit and then another person will, or if there's a panel, they might work together and assign certain people to interpret for certain people. So that's how you find an ASL interpreter. We've talked about this previously in this series, I believe, but when you're working with someone who has an interpreter, you want to make sure to talk to the person and not the interpreter, which might feel really rude at first, but think of the interpreter like a conduit for communication. Obviously it's a human being, so it's a little different, but like your cell phone, rather than you know, another human being. You wouldn't say like, hey Heidi, if Heidi was my interpreter, hey Heidi, can you tell Karen blah 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 blah. I would just say Karen and then whatever I need to say, if that makes sense. Okay, captioning. There are a couple different versions of captioning. There are some available on this screen webinar right now. There's auto captioning, which is what we're using, which involves AI software guessing what we're saying, and it usually gets it pretty accurately, and then interpreting that into text. And then there's live captioning, which is a human being on a computer somewhere typing while people are talking. Live or auto captioning, excuse me, is not considered for a live streaming event like this. If someone were to request captioning, auto captioning is not considered accurate enough to meet the accommodation request of someone requesting captioning unless they request auto captioning. It's typically best practice to pay for a captioner, and their rates are typically the same as an ASL interpreter-ish. And you can do that. There's a company in Vermont called White Coat Captioning. There's Rev. There's lots and lots of companies online who can do captioning, especially for streaming stuff. So the next one is audio description. So there's audio description for videos. Many streaming services have it built in now as a track you can select in the language. And AIL Library has a collection of audio described movies for patrons that are sent through the mail. And I'm going to send a link to that if you're not familiar already. Let me copy and paste here. Okay, there's also alt text and image description. So that is making sure that on your website, all images have what's called alt text, or something that is read aloud when a screen reader software is scanning the web page. And there's just the last few. Sorry, folks, I know I'm slamming a lot of information at you at once right now. The next one is Braille, large print, and audiobooks. These are three options that are also all available through the AIL library. And because Karen's with us, I'm sure if folks have questions about AIL and the services they offer, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Karen, but I feel like you'd probably be the best person to answer those. But Braille is, how would I describe Braille? This is fun. I don't know that I've ever had to do this before. So it's a translation of like traditional written printed text into something that people can read by feeling it with their fingers if you've never seen Braille. And then large print is traditional print text, but in larger text. And large print is subjective. It means different things to different people. Individuals have their own preferences. So if someone requests large print, I highly recommend asking them what their preferred font size is. One person might say 32, someone else might say 72, somebody might say 14. And there's a big difference between 14 size font and 32 size font. Okay, and the last one is with print materials, there's all sorts of different, we have a whole training on graphic design that actually we just did for the Vermont Arts Council. So I will link to the page on the Vermont Arts Council series, and I highly recommend checking out the graphic design one if you're interested in accessible print materials. But in general, you want to shoot for maximum readability on your print material. So that means left aligning your text, and making sure that you're choosing a font that's easily legible, things like that. Okay, and that's sort of the tip, I would say, the most commonly asked for accommodation requests. There's certainly many more access features you can build into things. The list is sort of limitless. And if anybody has any questions about specifics, you can always contact us or the New England ADA Center. They're a great resource for that. Okay. Now, before I end, I have on my notes here, I just remembered I wanted to share a really awesome story about accommodations and why it's important to build them in, and why it's important to market them when you have them. So those access symbols. So we used to run excuse me while I take a sip of water, a drum festival called Boom Vermont. I shared a poster for it before. And if you're not familiar, Boom Vermont originally started in Heidi, what building was it in originally at St. Mike's?
Oh, first it was in Burlington downtown, and then I went to Ellie Long.
Oh, right.
And then
Okay.
to the library. Yeah.
Yeah. So then where it was for its last few years, and it was like the best location, was the Fletcher Free Library in Burlington. So you can imagine we took over the library, this quiet library, with a drum festival, and it was amazing. Obviously with their permission, we didn't just show up with a bunch of drums. But we would see, and it's around, I think the average was around 750 participants in a day, which is a lot of people in and out of there. So we had this full range of accessibility features, and there's lots of people coming in and out, and we had an information table right as people came in. They were looking for something particular. And this guy comes in off the street and just starts rapidly signing American Sign Language at me. And I know enough sign language to fingerspell and to say, my name is Katie, and I don't speak ASL fluently, which is exactly what I said. I said, my name is Katie, hang on 1 second, let me get you someone. And he had another question. And so we started writing on a piece of paper. And I said, we have interpreters here, let me go find one of them. So I found them and I brought them down, and he told me through the interpreter, he saw the Boom Vermont Drum Festival thing, was really interested, and was like, oh, there's no way that's accessible for me if it's a music event. But then he saw the access symbols on the bottom and saw the one for American Sign Language. And the whole reason he came in, this man who speaks ASL and is deaf, was because he saw that we offered American Sign Language, and there's no way he wouldn't have otherwise. And there are countless stories like that where people come to something, not just of our programs, but beyond, because it was accessible, or because they were told it was accessible. And the last thing I'll mention is that sometimes you can get accommodation requests and you're not sure if you can meet them or not. And just because someone makes an access request, so they call you up and they say, I want to make this access request, it doesn't mean that you're obligated to fulfill it. It just means that you're required to respond and provide due diligence to meet the request. So it might mean, this is just an example, it might mean that someone calls you the morning of an event and they say, I want American Sign Language interpretation. But it, on average, takes like 2 weeks to get an interpreter signed up for an event. You can't just call Van Crow and say, do you have somebody for this afternoon? That's not how it works. So that would be what's not considered a quote unquote reasonable request, because you can't do it in terms of timing. You might get someone who makes a request for verbal description of something, and you call everyone down the chain who does verbal description in the state, and no one's available. You can't meet the request because no one's available. If you ever have a question about whether or not someone's request is quote unquote reasonable, then I highly recommend getting in touch with the New England ADA. I'm going to put a link to their website in the chat box. It's a free service and it's an anonymous service. And we aren't lawyers, but they are. We can totally advise you on where to go and how to arrange these services, but the New England ADA can guide you on the law behind it, which is really helpful. And it's totally anonymous. And they're just, in our experience, really great thinking partners, problem solvers. Sometimes we call them if we're like, hey, we want to know what this access symbol means, or we got this request for this thing that we've never heard of before. Can you tell us more about it? You know, they're just really, really great thinking partners. So I'm going to find their link and give us a pause for questions and stuff if folks have any.
This is Heidi. You're not going to be tested on any of this.
I should have prefaced with that.
Well, it's a bookend, right?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, a few years ago, one of our libraries had a request from a deaf-blind Spanish speaker for an event. We were stumped where to go with that. Heidi, do you have any recommendations?
I think I'm going to do the process part and then the specifics, because that kind of question or that sharing comes into the thing we were talking about, Katie mentioned about just because someone makes the request doesn't mean that you have to fulfill it. There's the due diligence. And what I would say is to go to the VanCro ASL interpreters. They have, I'm so familiar with their online form now, but you know, it's like, is it in person or remote? And the digital time has changed sort of the whole process for doing ASL, but there's also a place where it's either American Sign Language, deaf-blind, there might be other categories because deaf-blind Spanish is a very specific access request. And so they may have a resource or a database with that specific thing. Another piece that I always like to say, and when we get to the process, the sort of next part where this is a great bridge into that, is to ask the person. We don't want to put the labor of finding the accommodation requests and all of that on the individual with the disability. But sometimes deaf consumers in particular, from the VanCro form, you can make requests, like people build relationships. So deaf consumers build relationships with ASL interpreters. So they might be also to make some suggestions about who's available for that as well. And, you know, when I'm hearing in that, and maybe this is mishearing it, but you know, this is something I'm not familiar with. I always think that New England ADA is another thinking partner. They may not be able to give you the direct resource, but they can think through how to respond, because that might not be a request that can be fulfilled. And sometimes that just feels a little squirmy. You know, you like, one, you're surprised. You also want to fulfill the need. You're learning as you go. And sometimes there's just more than, you know, a period done end of statement on that one. So that's my kind of first thought response to both that specific request, but also the process of when something comes in and it surprises you.
Thanks. And Jeanette says thank you as well. I'm going to do Cheryl's question and then you're up next, Karen. Okay, so Cheryl asks, is a request to allow an emotional support animal an accommodation we must make provisions for? Legally, no. Legally, you're required to make accommodations for a service animal, and an emotional support animal by law is not considered a service animal. While we were talking, I pulled up this link from the National ADA, which is an FAQ on service animals. Legally, when someone comes through the door with an animal, you're allowed to ask 2 questions. 1, is that animal a service animal? And 2, what are, I can't remember the exact verbiage, but it's something like, what are the services they are trained to perform? Those are the 2 questions you can ask. So if you ask, is that a trade service, or is it, the exact wordage is in this ADA article, but like, is that a legally designated service animal? If they say yes, then you say, okay, what are they trained to perform? And that's it. That's all you can ask. But it gets complicated when you have, you know, a common question we get is, well, what if someone wants to bring in a service animal, but the animal, how do I phrase this, is not listening to its trainer? Or, you know, because at the end of the day, they're animals, right? And, or you have a patron who maybe at the library who's really afraid of animals, or you have someone who's allergic. Like that can happen in offices where someone wants to bring their service animal to work with them, someone else is allergic. I don't know. There's lots of different scenarios that can pop up. That's a great question for the ADA. If you have like really specific circumstances. But the short answer is no. You do not need to make accommodations for a emotional support animal because by law they're not protected like a service animal is. Karen, go ahead.
So I have a question about, so I think that a lot of libraries might be hesitant to use that, the question mark access symbol, just because they're afraid that the accommodation request is going to be too expensive for them to meet. And so do you have any thoughts around that or suggestions?
This is Heidi, and Karen, thank you for that question. And I think that the cost of accommodations is something that is a systems-wide situation. So I'm going to try to get to a systems perspective just because I know that impacts individuals. And I think that, yes, some accommodations absolutely cost money. And, so what I would suggest is to plan for the next year's budget to build in an accommodations budget. I know the Vermont Arts Council, some of the grant reviews, they look for, how are you considering access features and things like that. So things are changing in systems levels where there's an understanding or an increased understanding that inclusion sometimes has a budget line, often has a budget line with it. And organizations can be proactive and include that. In the moment, I think, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but what's air quotes reasonable does take into account the organization as well as the individual. And it's really gray. And so for people who like, systems and a black or white or this category here, I don't have an answer around yes or no, but what I would say is, I just encourage you to try it. I think that to include the access symbol and see what happens, because you will learn from that process. And I think there's probably, I don't know if this is true or not, but I know for me, when I'm not doing something because I'm afraid, I'm often surprised at how that fear wasn't really actually panning out in what was happening. And again, I know that's not a budget conversation, that's more of a human one. But the way that the access symbol says, we're here, we're open, we're trying, we want to include you, will connect you with more people in the community than you might have thought about before. And it might be an opening to, all sorts of wonderful things. And sometimes wonderful things cost money, but you can plan ahead. You can talk to the board. You can bring it to, I would say, like the ABLE library, consulting, like, how do I manage this? And that's part of the learning. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And I like how you mentioned that, it can bring in people who you might not normally see in a library. And I think that to your point, that if you're getting a lot of accommodation requests, then that's even more of a reason to build that into your budget, because as it turns out, that's part of serving your community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recommend people, to start, just like pick a day and start. Every new grant application from here on out includes a line item for accommodations. And there are, if you need to make physical improvements to your space at all, or sometimes it can be not even like building a ramp, but like, I know some people have used funds like this for adding sensory backpacks or all sorts of training, all sorts of stuff. Highly recommend chatting with the Humanities Council and the Arts Council. They have some different grant options, and the Vermont Community Foundation. All of them have options that could be applied to something like this, if it were framed in the right way. And usually they're really open to helping you have, like, they want to fund projects like this. I can speak for, I mean, I can't speak for them, but in my experience, they're really passionate about and have a priority for accessibility at the Arts and the Humanities Council. So, yeah. And if they don't, they might know of another smaller family foundation or something that they've spoken to that has funds for something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And this is Heidi again, many of what we've talked about, the ASL, verbal description, they're sort of in process. And I, as somebody who uses audio description, I remember making a request at an event, and it was for a film screening, and the film actually had audio description, and the sort of behind the scenes stuff because I had my organizational hat on, I don't think it was clear that I was actually the individual requesting the access. So the back and forth in email was, well, nobody ever uses audio description. And I it's sort of a bit of a, it's not a catch-22, but the chicken and the egg, like, where does it start? So I think the question mark access symbol just begins the conversation about, opening up a back and forth. And it turns out that film, actually everybody heard the audio description and it was more than fine. But I was a little bit surprised from a person with a disabilities end to know that there was this sense that nobody uses it and that it might be disruptive to other people, which is not 100% true. And the disruption, some people, the audio description track might be distracting. So it's layered, and it's the question mark symbol just begins the conversation. And I think there's going to be some gray areas there and some learning, but in the end, through that process, between now and ideal, as Katie and I like to say, between now and ideal, there might be some bumps, but let's be part of the bumps so that we can get to a smooth place for people, like, in our lives and in our communities. I do have one more there's one more slide, and I'm doing a time check, and I think we have time to just sort of the process, the 101, if there aren't any more questions at this point, Katie.
Cheryl did ask, does Vermont Center for Independent Living help libraries or just individuals? I'm not sure on libraries specifically. I know that they have programs that are applicable to different types of organizations. So I will post a link to their services page, and I highly recommend just reaching out to them. They're really approachable. Like us, they really just want to work to make as many different places in the state as accessible as possible. So if you have something, a need, they, like us, are usually more than willing to help. Oh, thanks, Karen. They're usually more than willing to help out. And I believe Peter is still the director there, right, Heidi? You know?
Either director or deputy director.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah. But highly recommend chatting with them.
Great. And thanks everybody for your participation and your showing up today. Katie, if we can do that last slide. This is sort of the template for if somebody makes an accommodation request. You've had, many of you have had this. We just want to kind of go through a rundown, not the specifics, but sort of considerations, almost a checklist of considerations. And again, you won't be tested on this. But what we want you to know, besides the question mark symbol, question mark access symbol, is that if there's a question that you don't know the answer to, there's resources where you can find it. Because who here, any of us, like, knows everything, especially about something so complex as disability and access and inclusion. So Katie, if you don't mind sort of reading the slide kind of components, that would be helpful to me.
Yep. So this is a white slide with background with black text across the top. It says responding to requests and questions. There's an orange underline. And then it says 1, research, 2, capacity with a question mark, 3, prep work, also with a question mark, connect, follow up, and lean. And then the Inclusive Arts Vermont logo on the bottom right hand side. I
think lean might mean learn.
I thought so too. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is sort of just some considerations and some keywords for other things. I'm going to elaborate a little bit. The research is, if somebody makes the access requests, research what exactly it is. Katie mentioned large print. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So research could be the broad category of who out there does that, like ASL or something, or it could be the specifics to the individual of, when you mean large print, when you say large print, what does that mean? Is that 18-point font or 30-point font? Just to be specific. So you research what that request is, so you're kind of clear about what you're working with. Capacity is both internal capacity and external capacity. And when I say internal capacity, that's not like, do I have the time in my day to do it? It's more who on the team has the resource. Is there a point person for making accommodation requests? And the capacity internally at your library can be built within your team about, even deciding who might be the point person for the accommodation request and building your capacity that way. External capacity are things that Katie mentioned before, like the systems, the timing of things, and that might slip into the next one. Also, is it available? A deaf blind Spanish interpreter, that's a pretty narrow thing. Is there a capacity within the systems? Live audio description is another one in the state of Vermont that we're really working to build capacity on, but that's not something that exists wholeheartedly where we could just say, oh, contact that person and have it be set. There's a lot of capacity building that needs to happen there. The next one was, I think, time prep. Is that right? I'm going from my notes in my memory.
Prep work.
Prep work. Yeah. So things like if you were going to do an audio description or a verbal description of imagery of a slideshow, for example, just build in some time for some of the pieces that you might be able to work on internally. And also when you're doing marketing of events, just put in time, and we'll get to some of this for the workshop next time, but just plan on a little time for providing access for some of the features. And also the timeline for things like scheduling ASL. Sometimes it just takes time because you can't flip a switch to do it. You have to connect with other people. Katie, what was the next bullet? If you don't mind. Connect. This one comes from lived experience where I had made a request for large print for something. This was when large print was effective for me. And I didn't actually get it at the meeting. It was on the corner of a table somewhere obscure that I didn't know about. So if you're part of the team that's providing and preparing access features and accommodation requests, my suggestion is to connect with the person or the people who have requested it to make sure that those dots, that point A goes to point B, because that large print stood on that table for the whole meeting and I didn't have access to the information and I was kind of frustrated. So it's just a matter of bringing the people and the relationship piece into, the access feature is it's a thing, but part of the reason there's this thing is so that people can connect with the material in the event and just, have an awareness of that. And the last one I think is to follow up and learn. So after the event, especially if it's something new for you and you're learning and you have a learning organizational position, check in and see how it went, with that curiosity, like, how is that for you? What could we do differently? Is there anything we can improve? And just be, those sort of lifelong learning, if you can, around your own process and what it means to people and their experience. And I think there's one more, or is that the last one?
After connect is follow up and learn.
Okay, that was it. So this is just sort of a little bit of guidance for if that request comes in and it's a surprise for you. If you're unsure, to say one more time, if you're unsure about whether you can fulfill what the other resources are, you can contact disability organizations, access organizations in the New England ADA. They're great thinking partners. And if somebody might make the request verbally, they might make the request in email. And you don't need to fulfill the request, but you do need to respond. So if somebody emails you, I would suggest say, thank you, I have this, I'll do some research, I'll get back to you, and just sort of keep that communication loop going. I know our inboxes are all, well, I'm guessing inboxes are their own management thing, but just be aware. And part of designating somebody to respond to accommodation requests is that puts it on their radar, because not responding to a request is a response in some ways. And that's not okay. That's actually illegal. And I'm not trying to bring in the law to be scary, but just that basic human communication. While you don't need to respond, you don't need to fulfill it, you do need to respond to the requests. And it might happen in conversation. And if you're unsure, was that an access request or was that just a hope or a wish? That's again, something you can think through with other people who might be more aware of access and accommodations, because not everybody communicates in writing. Somebody might say, hey, the next time I'd like this in large print. And you can just make a note of that. Does that make sense to people? We do the last thumbs up, yes, no.
Looks like yes.
Great. Thank you again for your time. Katie and I are hanging out for another 10 minutes or so, just in case there's last questions. And Katie, do you want to do the wrap up and next steps for today?
Sure, yeah. So there will be an email that goes out with all the links we shared in today's chat box, as well as a link to a survey. We've said this before, but we take those surveys really seriously. So if you have 3 minutes and you want to fill it out and let us know how your experience was today in this training, it's really helpful for us. We always try to apply whatever suggestions people have in there for improvement to the next training. So it could directly impact your experience if you have thoughts. The recording will be available on the Vermont Department of Libraries website soon, along with a full transcript. And join us next week. Well, it'll be Heidi and Kat Redness from our office, because I will be on vacation. But join us next week for June 23rd for accessible Zoom meetings and events. And save the date for June 30th, which is when open office hours will be, which is when Heidi and myself will just be hanging out on Zoom, and you can come ask us any questions, bring us a specific situation you've always wanted to chat through, anything at all. We're here to help. All right. Thanks everybody so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. And